We're very pleased to have with us this evening Rory Hodd, who's a specialist in bryophytes and is going to talk to us this evening about Ireland's oceanic flora and also about the tropics and Himalayas. So a wide-ranging talk. So we're looking forward to it. Over to you, Rory.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for inviting me, because it's great with Zoom now that you can, it would be unlikely I would have ever been able to come to Leicester and give this talk to you in person, but with the power of Zoom, you can hear about these Irish special plants. So today I'm going to talk to you about the oceanic flora of the west of Ireland and kind of, I suppose, northwestern Europe as a whole, focusing on some of the mosses and the liverworts and the ferns that also grow in the tropics and the Himalayas, and just talk about some of those connections, which are quite fascinating and interesting to hear about. So first of all, so some of you might not be familiar with exactly what is a bryophyte. So the bryophytes are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, which are kind of three actually unrelated groups of plants that share a similar lifestyle, and they're kind of small, green, and easy to miss. But when you actually get up close and personal, they're fascinating range of variety and interest. So and they're generally really small, because unlike the higher plants, the flowering plants and the trees and so on, they don't have a vascular system, so they don't have there's no for transporting food and water up and down the plants. They can't grow very big, and they don't have a very strong structure, and they have no roots as well, so they absorb everything they need, but basically directly through their leaves. So most of what I'm going to talk about is the moss and the liverworts, and also I'll talk about a few fern species. And just to say that that although moss and liverworts, unless you get up really close, they look like you'd miss them, and they look like they're just kind of a very insignificant little fuzz growing on trees or rocks and so on. When you look up close, there's a real range of beauty and structures in them, and they're a very beautiful thing to look at and explore, and a lot of diversity as well. So this is just an example of one liverwort called Jubila hutchinsiae, and you can see that this shoot here is probably well, a couple of millimeters across, and when you look up close, you can see all these different leafy structures, these underleaves and lobes and so on, and it's quite a beautiful world to explore once you get up close and look in. So so why is when I say why is Ireland special, I'm talking about why is the bryophyte flora of Ireland so special. So if you look at if you look at the diversity of it, it's quite amazing. So in a European context, Ireland has about 50% of Europe's bryophytes, as opposed to only 10% of its vascular higher plant flora. So whereas it's poor in higher plants, it's amazingly rich in the bryophytes. And particularly, there's a high diversity of what are known as Atlantic species. These are species that in Europe only grow on the west coast along the Atlantic fringe of the continent. And interestingly, despite this diversity, there's actually no species of bryophyte that grow only in Ireland and nowhere else. And this is, well, as we'll see further on, it's because bryophytes move around so easily that there's nothing actually that has actually has speciated here and then not being able to move. But actually, some of the species in a European context are only found in Ireland and not in Britain or elsewhere in Europe. And apart from this, diversity of species, there's also how they grow. So along the west coast, and this applies to Scotland and Wales and parts of the west of England as well. You just go into a woodland or a sheltered area, and it's just this amazing lushness. So this example in the photo, you can just see every rock and tree is covered in moss or liverworts, and actually quite a bit of filmy fern I can see on there as well. But this is something you only really get where the climate is really suitable for these species. So just to give you kind of a context of what I'm talking about when I say the oceanic northwestern fringes of northwestern Europe, or hyperoceanic in some cases. So basically, we're looking at the area from southwest Norway down to the Faroes, particularly northwest Scotland, but also all along the west of Britain, then the west of Ireland, northwest of Spain and Portugal, and then the Micronesia, so Azores, Madeira, and Canaries. So north of southwest Norway, it's kind of too much of an Arctic climate, too cold and icy, for a lot of these oceanic species. And then once you're getting down to the Azores, Canaries, and so on, you're getting in towards the tropics, they're kind of subtropical. But this in the middle is kind of the temperate zone, which is the zone I'm really talking, this oceanic northwestern Europe that I'm going to be talking about today. So what is it that makes it so special for bryophytes? And that's really the climate. So the climate of these areas is a temperate oceanic climate. So this means a few things. So first of all, the temperature is very even, doesn't change much, and it's just a very small annual range, so never too hot, never too cold, and always in kind of a middling kind of range. Then there's a lot of rain, and it's very frequent is the most important thing. So the amount of rain is less in a lot of areas, but the actual frequency is the special thing, really, because it's raining, I think over 225 days a year in the far west of Ireland and Scotland. And then because of all this cloudiness brought about by the proximity Atlantic, you don't have that much sunshine, so it's always quite dull. Nothing really dries out, and there's always high humidity because of that. And this is what we call oceanicity, this effect of the ocean. And there's a very strong gradient of this from the west coast to the east. So even if you go like 50 to 100 kilometers east, you find there's a much less oceanic climate, and these climatic factors are really lessened, and the flora then, as a result, is quite different. So it's really the very far west of the continent and of Ireland and Scotland in particular that has this highly hyperoceanic climate. So some of the features of oceanicity, first of all, there's very little frost, so there's a long growing season, and not very hardy plants are able to survive and grow. The summers are cool, so things don't dry out, as I was saying, and it's all very kind of moderate and even. And then the high year-round rainfall, which leads to, first of all, the soil's oversaturated, so you get formation of peat, and you also have very high, constantly high air humidity, which again for the bryophytes and other humidity reliant species, that's a very important thing. And then because it's very cloudy, well, if there was a tree line, most of the places the tree line's been lost because of human activity, but if there was, the tree line would be remarkably low for this latitude, so 600-700 meters. So that's kind of some of the main effects of this oceanic climate. And another thing you get because of this climate is a temperate rainforest. You never really think of rainforest as being a European thing, an Irish thing, or a British thing, but actually in the west of Ireland, west of Scotland, and Wales and the west of England, you get this temperate rainforest, which is a very special habitat, which is always moist, almost humid, and is very important for bryophytes and ferns. So just some of the features of a temperate rainforest. What makes a temperate rainforest really? So it's in some ways it's similar to a tropical rainforest, but it's also quite different. But some of the things that make it a rainforest, that result from this climate and make it kind of a rainforest. First of all, that you get epiphytes, so plants growing on trees. So this is maybe in a slightly extreme example, but you can see that every branch is draped in moss there, and there would also lots of ferns you get on trees, and even sometimes you get other trees and shrubs growing directly on tree branches. This is something that's a direct result of the humidity, and something you see in rainforests throughout the world, in the more humid places. So for example, just in temperate rainforests on the other side of the world in New Zealand, you see similar, totally different species, totally unrelated species, but very much the same growth habit of every branch being draped with mosses. And then when it's really humid and where you have some kind of evergreen vegetation, a long-lasting vegetation, you get what are known as epifills. So these are plants that grow on the leaves of other plants. So in in Northwest Europe, most of the species in our rainforests are deciduous, so the leaves don't really last long enough for epiphyls to grow. But there is some evergreen plants, and where it's really humid, you do actually see this. It's something you'd associate more with tropical rainforests, like this one in India on the left. But actually, sometimes you do see it in Ireland. So this is actually, in this photo, is a half dead frond of the Killarney fern in a very humid ravine, and I think there's 2 species of moss on that frond, one liverwort, and also the gametophyte of the Killarney fern itself. So this green fuzz. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, the gametophyte. But just on this one dying frond, because of the humidity, you have this little community of bryophytes. So it's quite remarkable, really. And I suppose the ideal habitat, I suppose, these species don't grow everywhere within places with this oceanic climate. So the ideal habitat really is humid ravines, where there's a stream running through the middle, wooded and lots of rocks around, and then you really get a rich array of these oceanic species. And even in otherwise denuded landscapes. So this is a heavily grazed hillside, which is, got a lot of sheep on it. Most of it is very poor for biodiversity. But then you have this little ravine running down the middle of it. And even just this little ravine provides a niche for all sorts of interesting species. So where the climate is right, you will get, interesting bryophytes and ferns. And sometimes to find these species, you have to really dig down and deep into the rocks. And this is just me finding bryophytes in some boulders, but they really like their humid little niches. So now I'm just going to go through some of these interesting species. I've talked a bit about their habitats, and then I'm going to talk about the species themselves and their very remarkable distributions. So I'm just, as I say, just going to talk about a few species. So the first species I'm just going to talk about briefly is this little liverwort here. So this is called radula haltiai, and you can see these little green kind of translucent little shoots, and then these trumpet-shaped things are what's called the perianth, which the actual sporophyte comes out from later on. So this is a species that grows in dark holes like the one I was sticking my head in there, and is basically very much restricted. So if you look at it in Ireland and Ireland and Scotland, two very dark, wet crevices, usually in and around streams. And if you look at its worldwide distribution, it's almost endemic to Northwest Europe, but grows Ireland, Scotland, then a small bit in Iberia, and then Azores and Madeira down there. So actually, this is one of the species that was thought until recently to grow in Ireland, but not the UK, one of the few species. But it was, I think, in the last 10 years, it was found in 2 places in Scotland. And then this is Legenia hibernica, which is another little liverwort that grows in similar places. And this has not to date anyway been found in Britain, but grows mainly in the southwest of Ireland in kind of dark overhangs. And again, with a similar distribution, lots of it in the Azores and Madeira, and then that's kind of it for for its worldwide distribution. And another related species, Legenia flava, so another Legenia species, another little liverwort, this lovely yellow liverwort that grows kind of mainly on rocks and sometimes on trees, and is mainly southwestern Irish, and again not in Britain. And this has a much wider worldwide distribution, quite a remarkable distribution. So it's Ireland is really its northernmost worldwide location, and then again, Azores, Madeira, Canaries, and also North America, and then across the tropics. It's quite common across the tropics, I think, so mainly across the tropics, and even grows as far south as New Zealand. So actually, I'm not sure whether I think New Zealand might be hidden on your screen, but there's also a dot for New Zealand. So this is an amazing worldwide, it's a tropical species which just about gets into the temperate zone north and south and grows around the globe. And it's an amazingly wide distribution for an individual species. So this is a kind of thing you'd never get in a higher plant, that you'd never have a very few. I don't think that there's no higher plants that would have that kind of wide distribution. So bryophytes, they do have some remarkably wide distributions. And then another species, which is a northern outlier of a tropical genus acribulbus, which is this little green plant at the bottom of the photo with these little bilobed leaves. There's a bit going on in this photo, but this is the one here. And again, restricted to very humid places in the far west of Ireland and Scotland. And this one also grows up into the Faroe Islands, and then outside of here in the Azores, Madeira, there's no other species. So this is a genus that would have more species in the tropics, and then just as one northern outlier. Another little liverwort is Keflozia crafolia. So this is usually grows in very dark, shady places. And interestingly, this is a species that in the west of Ireland in particular, and it's really benefited from the spread of invasive rhododendron. So it likes it, if the humus growing under rhododendron, dark places, very humid, with a good layer of humus, that's the perfect habitat for it. So you often find it under dense rhododendron, where it's thought, you think of rhododendron as killing biodiversity, but actually for some of these oceanic bryophytes, it actually provides a niche that wouldn't otherwise exist or would be quite limited. So it's kind of interesting consideration when you're talking about controlling this terribly invasive species. What do you do about the rare bryophytes you might be impacting? But that's something for another talk. And this one has a slightly different distribution to the other species I was talking about so far. So this is mainly South America, Latin America, and Caribbean, and then you can see there's the gap across the ocean, and then you have the Azores and Madeira and up to Ireland. So quite this is what's called, which will come up again as a disjunct distribution, where it grows in two very separate areas with a large gap in between. And then one more leafy liverwort is this one, a plagiocolo heterophila. So this was previously thought to be, in Europe, this was previously called plagiocolo atlantica, and it was thought to be endemic to Europe. And then with genetic work, it was found to be the same species as a South American species, plagiocolo heterophila. So now we have again this disjunct distribution. This is one that actually doesn't grow in the Azores and Madeira, and then there's an even bigger gap. So it's just Ireland, Scotland, France, and then the Caribbean and South America. So it's got this massive gap in its distribution, which is quite striking to see, really. And then just briefly a couple of thallus liverworts. So there's two different types of liverworts I didn't mention earlier. There's the leafy liverworts, which are all those ones I was talking about before, and then these are the thallus liverworts, which form these flat kind of thalli as such, plants not with leaves and stems, whereas the leafy liverworts do have those. So this is a liverwort called mortera hersuta, and this is a very widespread tropical species, which gets into which occurs in Europe as far and as northernmost worldwide sites are in Scotland, and it really seems to grow really well certainly in the west of Ireland, the southwest of Ireland. It's very happy there, and it seems very much at home, and it's one that, as I say, grows across the tropics. And it's so I was a good few years ago now, I was in the Western Ghats in Kerala, and I was delighted to come across this species, which is a real nice. It's always nice to see a species that from home, somewhere far from home. So and the same species all that distance away. And you think that this is the forest in which this species is growing. You'd think that that's quite a very different to Ireland, but when you look at it, there's similar conditions, very humid, lots of little niches for the plants to grow, and another liverwort that I saw there was one called ailees, and this is even more widely distributed than mortera, and typically in the tropics it would grow in tropical forests such as this. And in Ireland it's quite a rare species, and in Britain as well. And its most typical habitat is extremely different to its tropical habitat. So there it's kind of a humid forest species, and in most places in Ireland and Britain, it grows in this kind of habitat, which looks like, at first glance, is a very uninteresting, degraded habitat. So this is one site for it, on the edge of a forestry plantation where the peat has all been cut away, and you just got this wet kind of ditch which has been filled with the purple moorgrass legenia, which is basically a really poor habitat where very few things grow. But if you actually part the leaf litter produced by the purple moorgrass, you see that there's these bryophyte layer, and then you have this little liverwort palo growing in there. So it's a case of it's managed to find, even though there wasn't much of its habitat that it's used to in the tropics, it's managed to find its niche in a very different place in Ireland. So it's quite interesting to see that adaptability. And now just a few interesting mosses. So this is one of my favorite mosses, which is cycloaddiction, which has the very alluring English name of bright green cave moss. So it kind of shines out from caves and always grows in very dark places, and it's got this lovely kind of shine to it. And this one again is mainly a tropical African species and up through Micronesia, and in Ireland it grows in woodland and along streams in dark overhangs and crevices. But in Britain, it grows in Cornwall, and I think it's on the Isle of Islay or Jura, and it only grows in sea caves in Britain. But in Ireland, it's quite happy in forests. So it's an interesting thing. But in Ireland, I think it has been found in sea caves very rarely. But it's as I say, it's more in Ireland. It's more in the habitat that it would have further south in tropical areas. And it's cycloaddiction belongs to the order of mosses, the hukiri ailees, which has 3 species of this order in Europe, all of which grow in Britain and Ireland. And one of these, hukiri lucens, is actually quite a common species throughout Britain and Ireland and a lot of Europe. But I say there's only 3 species in Europe of this hukiri ailees, which has many species in the tropics. These are the 3 species that have managed to make it up this far north as such. And the third species is this little species Daltonius splachnoides, which is has an interesting story, because until about 20 years ago it was thought that this was a really rare species that in Ireland, Scotland only grew in the far west in a very specialized humid habitat in ravines. And then people started finding it on willow trees along the edges of conifer plantations. And since then, it's really spread. So in Ireland, it's quite widespread, and it's been found in England, and it's been found in Wales, and it continues to be found in new sites. So this seems to be a plant that, maybe because of climatic factors, it's managed to spread out and find its niche. And now it's always spreading, whereas 20 years ago it would have been really rare. And another group of mosses which are represented by only a few species in Europe, but are very diverse in the tropics, are the somatophyllaceae. So this is a very tropical family of mosses, and we have 3 species. So this one, Somatophyllum demissum, which is in Ireland and Britain, is extremely oceanic, only grows in the far west. But interestingly, in continental Europe, it's not oceanic, so it grows in places like Germany, France, and it's kind of strange that. But this is a very a moss I always love finding, because it's got this lovely color, and it kind of shines out at you when you're walking through the woodland. You can spot it from a way off because it has this very distinctive color. So in this photo, I could see it from a distance, before I even got to it. So you can just see that rock there that has this moss with this kind of yellow kind of color to it, and its English name for this group are the signal mosses. So I think that's a very apt name, because they kind of, you know, they shine out and they signal you and beckon you over. And this is another member of the Somatophyllaceae, the Hagenia micans, and you can see this lemon yellow kind of moss that's growing on this rock, and again it just shines out and it's a completely different color, kind of exotic color compared to the other bryophytes around it. So I'm going to talk about a few ferns that are representative of tropical families. So the first one I'll talk about is the Killarney fern, formerly Trichomanes speciosum, now Vandenboschia speciosa, which, as the name suggests, is quite grows very well in Southwest Ireland around Killarney, and was, you know, known from there for a long time, but was very much prized because of its beauty and its size and its overall appeal. Was really prized by Victorian fern hunters. So this went from being, you know, there's reports of it growing, you know, covering like whole rock faces, down to, you know, being almost extinct because people were just taking it away by the barrow load. But now this species is coming back and seems to be one of the few species, from what I've seen anyway, I think it's actually benefiting from climate change. So it likes, you know, if the climate's getting, you know, more humid, more wet, and a bit warmer, that's really favoring it. So this is a very interesting species, as it can grow independently. So ferns have, you know, what's known as alternation of generation. So they have what's called the gametophyte generation and the sporophyte generation. So the sporophyte generation is what you'd know as a fern with the fronds and the spores, which is the reproductive generation. But it's also the gametophyte generation, which in the Killarney fern is this green fuzzy mat that almost looks like a snooker table, the surface on a snooker table, and this can occur independently of the sporophyte. In many places you have this, but you don't have the sporophyte. So this is kind of a thing that occurs in very few species. I think there's a species in North America that's actually of Vandenboschia that's only known as the gametophyte generation. Has never actually had sporophytes recorded. So this Trichomanes vandenboschia, the Trichomanes that it used to be, is a very large tropical genus of filmy ferns, which has, I think, about 1,000 species, and this is the only species of Trichomanes that we get in Europe. And again, it's an outlier of this large tropical family that at some point has made it to Europe. And there's two other filmy fern species in Northwest Europe, two hymenophyllum species, so the Tunbridge filmy fern and the Wilson's filmy fern. And again, you know, the hymenophyllum is a large tropical family that tropical genus that just has a couple of representatives in Northwest Europe. And one more fern to talk about, which is a very surprising discovery a few years ago that turned up in Southwest Ireland, was this little fern here called Stenogrammatis myristoides. So this little fern is what's known as a grammatid fern, and this was a group of ferns again that's it's mainly a tropical group of ferns, and until this Stenogrammatis was found in Southwest Ireland in Clonard National Park in 2019, these ferns were not known. No members of the grammatid ferns were known to occur in Europe aside from Micronesia. So there's different species of grammatid fern that grow in Micronesia, in the Azores and Madeira, but none were known from continental Europe. So this species, its distribution until 2019 was just Cuba, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and then it was found, I think, 6,000, 7,000 kilometers away to the northeast. So I mean, you know, how did it get there is the big question. So that was quite an unexpected and surprising discovery. So I'm going to talk now about some of the species that we share with the Himalayas. So I think, again, like a tropical forest, you know, there's not much in common between Northwest Europe and the Himalayas. You know, But if you walk through the a rhododendron forest, this is a rhododendron forest at about 3,000 meters in West Bengal. It feels there's certain things that feel familiar from the far west of Ireland. So the high humidity, lots of little niches for species to grow, and lots of mist and rain, and quite cool as well because of the altitude. So although this at first glance, this scene from Southwest Ireland looks quite different, there's a few of the same species thrive here as would in the previous photo. So with instead of having a canopy of rhododendron, you have, first of all, you have the rock walls surrounding to keep the humidity in, and then you have the boulders and the rock faces and the gullies that create this very specific microclimate. So the most interesting of community formed by these species is what's known as the mixed northern hepatic mat. So this is a community of leafy liverwort species that grow in places like I showed you in the last slide, on north-facing dark mountain corries, where there's lots of rain and cloud and high humidity, and are composed of these really relatively large leafy liverwort species that have these fascinating distributions. So this is just a couple of the more common species of that hepatic mat community. So the rusty orange species here with the thin leaves, that's Hersuta hutchinsiae, which is a European endemic. And then the purple worm-like plants, that's called Pleurosia purpurea, which is also a species that grows quite widely in the far west of Ireland and Scotland, in bogs and heaths, but particularly thrives in this hepatic mat community. So this can be a really beautiful community, and if you're in the right place, and you can just see all these cushions of liverworts covering the slope. So it's quite a beautiful sight. So just looking at the distribution of Pleurosia. So this has kind of a typical distribution of these hepatic mat liverworts. So Ireland and Scotland, then in this case you've got the Faroes and Norway as well, then the north east and coast of North America, so and up into Alaska and down to kind of Oregon, I suppose mainly around kind of British Columbia, that kind of area, and then the Himalayas and the odd tropical island here and there where it's kind of randomly seems to have colonized. So in this case, you have the gap is mainly across the continent rather than across the ocean. And then another species with a similar distribution is this species here called Mastagophora woodsii, which is one that again is Mastagophora is a genus that's mainly tropical and subtropical and montane tropical, but this species again has a similar distribution. So you can see that it occurs across these three areas, mainly as say northwestern North America, northwest Europe, and the Himalayas, plus just the odd place in the tropics. So in this case, it's at some point it ended up in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And then this species, Companion embosa, this is the species, this red shoot in the middle with the long spines on the leaves. So this is Companion embosa, which is an extremely rare species in Ireland, which I think occurs in 4 sites in Ireland now, but in very small quantity. And again, it has a similar distribution. And just to point out here, the diversity of these hepatic mat communities that in this little photo, and actually the photo this is cropped from, you can see more species. But even in this little photo, you can see probably at least 7 or 8 different liverwort species in an area of that's about 5 by 5 centimeters maybe. And I think if you go into the bigger photos, about 15 or 20 species of bryophyte there. So it's a really amazingly diverse community, but it's I suppose you could almost call it a mini rainforest as such. And if you kind of zoom out and look where this photo was actually taken, it's somewhere that at first glance would be totally inhospitable. So it's at the top of a 700 meter high slope above the Atlantic on Achill Island in County Mayo on the far west. And it's not where you'd expect to have this lush, diverse community of bryophytes. And yeah, just to show you the distribution of this companion nimbosa, this one is one of those. It doesn't actually grow in the Americas at all, but is mainly Himalayan, and then just grows Ireland, Scotland, and fairly recently found in southwest Norway as well. And then this is another one of these Himalayan species. So this is plagiocolo carantonia, these the yellow shoots with the flattened yellow shoots. So a very beautiful little species. It's actually very rare in Ireland, but in the right place in Scotland is relatively frequent. And this has this very, very limited distribution, Himalayas, then Northwest Europe, and nowhere in between. And then another species of this hepatic mat community is this one, Adelanthus lindenbergiana. So this has actually got a slightly different distribution, a quite curious distribution, this one. So this is one of the rarest of these species. So it mainly grows in Ireland. It grows in 10 or 11 sites in Ireland, and then 2 sites in Scotland, and nowhere else in Europe. And then if you look at its wider distribution, it's mainly a southern hemisphere thing. So kind of from Patagonia, Falkland Islands, and various other island groups down there, and then South Africa, tropical African mountains, and then the Yucatan Peninsula comes up. So that must be, I don't know much about the bryophyte flora of the Yucatan Peninsula, but it seems to be a lot of these species turn up there. And then there's that big gap then up to Ireland and Scotland. And then, yeah, a couple more species of this community. This is Companion Anthropodioides, another one that's limited to the same distribution as the previous species, not the last one, but the ones before, with the growing, Ireland, Scotland, then Himalayas, and the northeast coast of North America. And this yellow species here is Pisania pearsonii, and again has the same distribution. And there's also some mosses. Just to say, it's not all about liverworts. So some of the mosses do it too. So this is another species that has that same three regions, Dicranodontium uncinnatum, and this one as well, Paraleptodontium recurvifolium. Again, have this curious distribution. And then this one's an oddity. So well, those of you who know a bit who've done a bit of bryophyte recording and surveying would know the genus Didymodon as a horrible genus to deal with, because all the species in it generally are tiny, very indistinct looking, and hard to tell apart from each other. But there's in an island there's one exception to this, Didymodon maximus, which, as the name Maximus suggests, is a large and handsome species and totally unmistakable. And this is actually quite a small example of it. It can form massive cushions on wet cliffs and rocks, and only grows in one area in Ireland, on the Dartry Mountains in the northwest of Ireland, Sligo and Leitrim, where there's very unique situation where you have limestone outcrops at quite high altitudes. So there's a fascinating flora, but this is the only one that grows only there and nowhere else, and indeed nowhere else in Europe. So the only place in Ireland where it's actually quite common on the Dartry Mountains, or frequent at least, just in this small area, and then nowhere else. And there's one similar species called the Dymodon giganteus that grows in the Alps, but you can prove it's not the same species. And then the next place you find it is in Mongolia, in the far east of Russia, and then again in the Pacific Northwest of North America. So really, the fact that it grows in an area of what's about maybe 20 by 20 square kilometers of the northwest of Ireland, and then nowhere again until Mongolia, is quite remarkable. So, I mean, the question really, with all these species, both the tropical species I was talking about and the Himalayan species is what's happening. How do we explain these distributions? So there's two kind of theories for this, generally being put forward for these kind of distributions. Either they're a relic of a wider distribution. So it used to be that these species, they occurred much more widely, across all the range between where they're now found, and then because of changes in climatic conditions, they were lost from these areas. But with a lot of these tropical species, what's in between is oceans. There's nowhere for them to grow. And then with the Himalayan species, what's in between is a very different continental climate, totally different conditions where it wouldn't be suitable for their growth. Or the other one, other theory which makes sense to me, certainly makes sense, is that these species have been spread by long distance dispersal. So basically that their spores have managed to travel these long distances and become established in other areas. So, I mean, what are the chances of a species being able to do that, being able to jump, is in some cases, is 7,000 kilometers. So firstly, in the case of both the bryophytes and the ferns I talked about, they have lots of spores, and the spores are tiny. So you're talking about maybe 20, 25 microns in size, or even smaller. And if you look at the direction of the prevailing winds in that hit the coast of Ireland and Britain, the prevailing wind in southwest Ireland in particular is from the southwest, and if you look where that southwesterly wind is coming from originally, it's from the Caribbean. So there's a kind of conveyor belt there, and it's that can bring spores, and it's very fast. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And there's the other thing, that a lot of these species also occur on the Azores or Madeira, so that can act as a stepping stone. So they can, so the spores can be blown from, say, the Caribbean, land, say, on the Azores, then a population grows there, and then they produce spores. More winds then take those off then to then colonize Northwest Europe. So certainly those islands can act as a stepping stone. In some cases, they have, well, certainly the species aren't found there now. They may have been at one stage and never established, but certainly that would help with dispersal. Another thing to aid the dispersal of these species is that they grow, in the tropics, they generally grow at quite high altitude, so maybe 2,000 meters. And that would make it easier for the spores, of course, to get into the atmosphere, because they would already be at high altitude, and I guess they could get blown off a mountain and into the atmosphere with greater ease. And also then, in terms of becoming established, say, okay, how's a tropical species going to be suited to the climate in Northwest Europe? But certainly in the far west of Ireland, it's the climate is surprisingly similar to a tropical cloud forest. That that the tropical cloud forest isn't that warm. It's not, it's maybe slightly warmer than Southwest Ireland, but still there's, as it's at altitude, it's quite cool. And then west of Ireland would have high humidity, lots of rainfall, lots of shade, and would be quite suitable for these species. So they'd be quite at home, and then they've shown themselves to be quite at home in this area. And if you think about it, all you need is for one spore to land in the right place to become established. So if there's thousands of spores in the air all the time, most of them would just rain down in the wrong place, and nothing would happen, and they wouldn't germinate. But all it takes is one spore to land in the right place. And over a period of thousands and thousands of years, there's lots of opportunities for that to happen. So I mean, it seems likely that, although it sounds far-fetched at first, maybe that these long-distance dispersal events for most of those species that I've been talking about happened at some point. However, I mean, then you say, most of what I've said there doesn't apply for those species that grow in the Himalayas or northwestern North America. And and that's true, yeah, that they wouldn't have the same opportunities, but at the same time, I guess that maybe they, that there's still questions to be answered and things to be proven. And also, most of these species never or extremely rarely have been known to produce sporophytes in Europe. So if they actually aren't producing spores, how are they getting around? So they do reproduce by fragments. So these species, if you just have a little bit of a leaf, it can still, it can form a new plant. But of course, it's much less likely that a fragment of a leaf would be carried on wind. So, so in those case, those species, it's not so clear cut, but at the same time, the other option seems less likely. And then to finish off, I mean, there's one question that really that I'm always asking, really fascinates me and makes looking at bryophytes and ferns to a lesser extent really fun and exciting, is because you never know what you're going to find next, what's going to turn up. You never know what might have what spores might have ended up in got blown over and germinated quietly in a quiet corner of oceanic woodland. So it's always quite exciting to think what might be out there. So I'm going to leave it there, and sure, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you for showing us some lovely photographs of some plants that don't always get very much attention. You did say you were happy to take questions, so if anyone wants a question, if they'd like to attract my attention in some way, either wave at me or put their hand up in the chat window or type it in the chat box, whichever you prefer. Russell has a question.
Yeah, Rory, thanks. That was a brilliant and beautiful illustrations, fascinating stuff. Could you tell me how are conservation situations? You mentioned, I think, the Killarney National Park. Are you okay for sheep protection and so on?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of issues. I mean, with Killarney National Park and all our national parks, there's a lot of issues with overgrazing by deer, rhododendron taking over, and out of control fires is the latest thing now. But where the bryophytes grow and where the ferns grow is such a humid and specialized niche as such that a lot of these things don't really affect them. So certainly the overgrazing affects the habitat a lot, and the fires would affect the habitats. But the actual bryophytes, they grow in such a specialized niche and then such a humid niche that they don't really get impacted that much. And then rhododendron is the issue that does impact them, which for some species is actually good for them because it gives them habitat, or in time when the rhododendron is really old, as I was saying, that gives them actually a nice humid dark niche for them to grow in. But of course then if that's cleared, then they lose that niche. So with the rhododendron clearance, then you just got to be, in a way, it's something that people haven't thought of, but they really need, I think they need to be very careful what they clear and how they clear it, and if they are going to clear areas, to somehow keep the shade, some way of keeping shade there while it transitions back to woodland. So it's a tricky situation, really.
Thank you.
I don't know if anybody else has got any questions. I don't know if that's someone. Jeffrey.
Yeah, so just thinking, efforts are being made in Western Scotland to reinstate the Atlantic rainforest there. Is there the same sort of impetus to do that in the west of Ireland?
Well, it's slowly gathering momentum. I mean, it's a case of the Atlantic rainforest now is kind of it's something that 5 years ago nobody knew the term an island. It wasn't in people's consciousness, but now it has been. It's been the people's awareness has been raised, and this conversation is there. So I think it's behind. We're a good few years behind Scotland, but I think that in the next few years, hopefully things are going to change and things are going to start up. but at the moment it's kind of the government, maybe the government hasn't kind of got behind it, but people, individuals have. So for example, there's one amazing rainforest in Southwest Ireland on the Beara Peninsula, where it's just this guy Owen, he bought this wood about 12 years ago, which was, at that time it was totally overgrazed by sheep, full of rhododendron, and he's just turned it from that into this most amazing thriving ecosystem. So things, at the moment it's kind of a small scale thing, but I think it is gathering momentum. So I'm hopeful now that in the next few years it'll take off.
Good.
And David has got a question.
Yeah, David.
Thank you, Rory. I enjoy that very much. We tend to think that the islands of today were there yesterday, but they weren't. The continents of today weren't like they are millions of years ago when Gondwana land existed. So the distances you might imagine spores traveling a long time ago is far different from it is now, isn't it?
True.
So, I think we have to think, we're assuming that these mosses and liverworts only evolved once in one place. Do we know that's so from DNA analysis or anything? Is it likely that the distribution of them took place so many millions of years ago that as the continents moved apart and so on, their distribution today doesn't in any way show what it was like millions of years ago?
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, and it is possible that explains that the distribution. But I think that climatically, if you think that if you can go back 10,000 years, where would have these species survived? In the last ice age, that it seemed and then because they're so kind of mobile that that they don't there doesn't seem to be it seems, I suppose, it's and just hard to imagine where that refugium might have been that they would have survived the last ice age. So, but it's possible. You can't rule these things out now. And I think everybody has a different different opinion on how these things might have come to pass as such. That,
sure.
But
spores are pretty long-lived, aren't they? We're finding things now that germinated and produced the next generation that are thousands of years old.
That's true. Yeah, that, and I think that's the thing with particularly with bryophytes, is they're not, they're poorly studied, so we don't really know, how long lived they are, so I think that's something that, actually I've never thought of that it could have been spores that have survived, that they could have just been dormant. That is a good point. That it's something to consider for sure.
Thank you.
Shall we take one more question?
And Anthony's got a question.
Okay. Anthony.
Hello. I was wondering about how these things dispersed, how far spores are likely to travel, and also whether some of these mosses and such like have particular associations with insects. I'm thinking about beetles during the last ice age, which are found all over the place, even though they are rare or absent from Britain now. There's even a beetle, Aphodis holderi, which you have to go to Tibet to find now.
Wow. Yeah, that's, and then again, as I was saying a moment ago, that these things haven't been studied. That that I don't know of any studies of spore dispersal by beetle, for example. That's something that, as far as I know, nobody's looked at. But it's quite quite a fascinating thing. And and if you look at and thinking about just a beetle that's that's only found in Tibet that was found in Britain. Again, that's and I don't know about beetles how easily they how far they would travel. That that it's fascinating. It's really, it kind of shows how much we don't really know. That it's a lot of it is kind of conjecture as such. That but it's interesting to consider. All right, yeah.
I think we should probably draw the recorded part of the session to a close now. So Hazel, can I just invite you to round off this part?
Yes, certainly. Well, Rory, that was absolutely fascinating. I just love this concept of this disjunction between plants in Ireland and plants in other parts of the world. I think it's absolutely fascinating story, and I just so enjoy hearing you talking about it. I mean, you've got fabulous pictures. What else was I going to say? Oh, I know one of the things I was going to say was the story about the rhododendrons bothers me, because I spend quite a lot of my time on nature reserves in Leicestershire cutting rhododendrons down, and I shall have to look under them more carefully and see if there are any exciting mosses growing there, but probably not. And the other thing that I wonder about is, you know, you were talking about this you know somebody who's got an area of land which is he's developed and is improving. Perhaps we want to go and visit it at some point. I mean, you know, presumably you have field trips to go and study the Bryophytes of Ireland. It sounds a really interesting way of going to visit Ireland.
True.
It's absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for coming and joining us and telling our group this. I just find it a fascinating story. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Yeah.